Have you ever tried to start building a puzzle from a random piece in the middle? It will work and you will be able to finish the puzzle, but it will probably take you longer than if you would choose to go in a certain pattern. For example, start building the frame and continue from there inside. The same thing happened when creating components in React. We can build components in different ways, but there are specific patterns that can help us to do it in a more suitable way. One of these patterns is the compound component pattern, which I'm going to talk about today. Hi, my name is Hadar. I'm a front-end developer at Minute Media. I have a bachelor degree in computer science from Ben-Gurion University. And for the past 1.5 years, I've been a part of the core team, who among other things is in charge of the company components library. A few months ago, I was given a pretty simple task: to create a selectable card component. Every time I need to create a new component, the first thing I'm doing is understanding what should be the component API. Our card should have a title, an image, a short description, and an isSelected prop in order to allow the user to control if the card is selected. When using React, we always need to think about composition. We don't want to have huge render functions that are not clear and readable. Instead, we want to build smaller, simpler, and reusable components and combine them together into one main component. So I splitted my card into card header, card image, and card content. Let's take a look at the code. Here we have the component props and the component state, Boolean that tells us if the card is selected or not, and our render function that contains the card header, the card image, and the card content. Let's take a look at the card header component. We have all the props that we receive from the parent. We have a checkbox for selecting or deselecting the card. And we have our title. And this is how the user will use our component. He will just pass all the props to the card. Great, our component is working and we are ready to release it. But then the design team came to me and asked if we can also support showing the description above the image. So I went back to the card and added description on top prop. And now this is how the render function looks like. We need to check whether to render the description before or after the image. And if it was the only new case, I guess we could leave it like this. But we started to get more and more new cases. We need to add closable option, add optional footer, and so on. At this point, I've started to feel that maybe this is not the best way to implement the component. As my API got bigger and bigger, and my component began to fill up with more and more props and if statements telling it how it should render. One of my teammates suggested that I try to use the compound component pattern, and that was exactly what I was looking for. What is a design pattern? It is a general, reusable solution to commonly occurring problem within a given context. As React was getting more and more popular, people start facing the same problem. So there was a need for design patterns that will help us overcome these problems, fasten our development time, and help us to create more clear and easy to maintain code. The compound component pattern allows you to create components that work together and have a shared state. In order to understand it, let's first see how the user will use our new implementation. Not like our first implementation, here the user needs to pass multiple components as children. These are all the subcomponents that make up the entire card. The card needs to receive only the props that are relevant to the entire component behavior, the ones that we need to share with multiple children. And each of the subcomponents receive only the props that are relevant to it. In our case, the header will receive only the title. The image will receive only the image source. And the content will only receive children. As you can see, I'm using the dot notation here. Instead, we could just export all the child components one by one. But since it doesn't really make sense to use these components outside the card, in my opinion, this export is more clear. Also, the user only needs to import one component in his code in order to use the card. Now, if the user wants to render the content above the image, all he needs to do is to change the order of the children. Let's see our new implementation. The first thing you should notice here is that the card component receives children, and just rendering them inside, it does not care which children it received or in which order they are. The second thing is that we are wrapping everything with context provider. If you are not familiar with React context, it is a way of passing data between components through the components tree without passing props down to every level. That means that every component that is rendered inside the card will have access to the context value. In our case, it's the isSelected flag and its setter. This is actually our shared state. Both header and image component are using it. Let's dive inside one of our child components, the card header. Since only the header needs to use the title prop, it is now part of the header API and not part of the card API. In order to access to the shared state, we are using React use context hook. The hook receives a context object, the one we created in the card component, and returns the context value. The rest of the component remains as it was before. Inside the other child components, we are doing the same thing. Each component has its relevant props as part of its API, and they all use context hook to access the shared state. So what did we achieve from using this pattern? One of the most common and annoying issues in React is prop drilling, when you need to pass props from the parent component to a child component, and the child needs to pass it to his child, and so on. Using this approach, we avoid that issue, since all the shared state is passed to the children using React context, and each component receives props directly from the user and not from the parent. Since the user is now in charge of placing the component children, he can place them in any order he wishes. We don't need to have props telling the card how it should render anymore. It is very clear what is the responsibility of each of the components. The parent component is in charge of managing the shared state, and each of the child component is in charge of its own UI part only. If we want to add another component to the card, for example a footer, we don't need to change the other component's code, not even the card itself. Having a component that receives too many props is usually more difficult to work with. Using this approach, we are not passing all the props into one big component. Instead, we are passing each component only its relevant props. We all know the famous phrase, where there is a great power, there is a great responsibility. We should always keep this in mind when using this pattern. Providing this much flexibility can sometimes lead to unexpected behavior, especially in the component loop. So we need to make sure that we are using it in the right case. So when should we use it? In components where you want to give the rendering power to the user, but still have all the component logic managed within the component itself. Good examples for components like this are dropdowns, tabs, accordions, and box components like modals. And I want to finish with some tips or steps on how to refactor a component to this pattern, after we decided that this is the right pattern for us. First, we need to understand who the child components should be. What are the smaller parts that make up the entire component? These are the parts that we want to allow the user to place in different orders or that are optional. The second step is understanding what should be the shared state, which data is relevant to the entire component. This state, along with its logic, should be managed within the parent component. And then we can start creating the APIs for each of the components and implement them. Hope you will try to use this pattern in the future, and maybe like me, after doing it once, you will want to go and improve other components by using the compound component pattern. Thank you, and if you have any question, please feel free to reach out.